Some stories are born in the wind that sweeps across the arid plains of the West. Others hide in the scars of a people the world has chosen to call savage. That was how they spoke of Quanah, the Comanche warrior with eyes as dark as a moonless night and skin scarred by the sun and war. To the white men of San Elmo village, he was an enemy, a barbarian who carried in his body and soul the blood of a people who refused to bow down. And even when Quanah simply rode through the borders of the dry lands, threatening no one, the whispers came, "There goes the savage." The sound of that word weighed more heavily than the desert sky itself. I remember seeing him from afar, mounted on his wild-maned horse, feathers tied to his black hair, which danced in the wind like the flags of a forgotten nation. He said nothing, asked nothing. He simply passed by, but his gaze was like steel, steady, silent, impossible to ignore. There was something about Quanah that made the world fall silent for a moment, a kind of power that comes not from brute strength, but from the dignity that cannot be stripped from a man. Even so, to the village, he would never be more than a savage. What no one knew, what no one even dared imagine, was that behind that cold countenance lay a restless heart, a soul that dreamed of something more than war and dust. Quanah had seen too much, lost too much, and he had learned that the hatred of the white man was no crueler than the abandonment the land itself knew how to offer. But he carried a secret with him, a promise he had made to himself that one day he would have a true home, not a war tent, not a hidden cave, but a home, made with his own hands, built not out of pride, but out of love. Share this story to reach further, subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment, and it is precisely love that truly begins this story. An unlikely love, born of humiliation, fueled by prejudice and loneliness. It was on a clear morning in front of the village church that everything began to change, when a woman was thrown out, her wedding dress still stained with dirt, and no one moved to help her. No one except the warrior the world called a savage. The bell of San Elmo Church rang loudly that morning, but it wasn't a call for blessing. It was the announcement of a shame no one wanted to admit. At the church door, before dry, judgmental eyes, stood Mary Beth, the bride everyone now despised. Her white dress, which should have been a symbol of purity, was wrinkled, torn, and stained with mud, as if the ground itself had spat her out. Her blonde hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared with tears that wouldn't stop falling. The church, which should have been a shelter, had become a courthouse. She had been mercilessly expelled by the pastor, who accused her. A woman who lies down before the altar does not deserve God's blessings. The groom, a man from a wealthy and traditional family, didn't lift a finger to defend her. Instead, he turned his back on her, fueling the chorus of condemnation that echoed through the wooden pews. Every word uttered was a knife thrust into her skin. Shame! Disgrace! Sinner! And there, alone, Mary Beth felt her world crashing down on her. No one reached out, no one offered a look of compassion. The dust kicked up by the horses of the guests leaving the venue felt like a cloak covering her with indignity, and all she wanted was to disappear. Walking barefoot, her feet bruised by the stones, she walked away from the village, aimless, without hope. Her white dress dragged along the ground like a sheet of defeat. The sky, once blue, now seemed complicit in this punishment, cloudless, without consolation. Mary Beth didn't know where she was going, only that she could never return. With each step, she felt the weight of the words she had heard, like invisible chains dragging her to a place of no return. But fate sometimes blows in unexpected directions. As the sun began to set, she heard the trot of a horse approaching. Fear made her want to run, but her strength had already left her. She fell to her knees, ready to accept the worst. But no violence came, no mockery, only an awkward silence broken by the sound of the horse stopping beside her. When she looked up, she saw the figure of Quanah, the Comanche warrior, watching her with a look she couldn't decipher. It wasn't pity, nor curiosity. It was something deeper, a respect she no longer believed she deserved. Without a word, he dismounted and offered his hand. Mary Beth hesitated. What could she expect from a man the entire village called a savage? But his touch was firm and warm, a contrast to the cold of the world she was leaving behind. She took his hand, and for the first time that day, she felt no shame, only weariness. And Quana, with a simple gesture, lifted her off the ground, as if rescuing something precious everyone had chosen to disregard. No promises, no questions, just action. Quana wasn't just a Comanche warrior. He was a survivor of a world that insisted on erasing his people's name. From a young age, he learned that the ground he walked on was sacred, but to the white man, it was merely land to be conquered. He saw his village burned, his brothers scattered by the wind like dry leaves, and his mother disappear amid the fire and steel of the invaders. He grew up among the elders who taught him that the heart of a Comanche is like a stone in a river. It resists the current, but never loses its shape. From then on, Quana walked alone, riding across the plains as if searching for a piece of himself. And it was on this path of solitude that he found a forgotten land where he built a small camp. Not a house, not a home, but a place where the wind told ancient secrets to anyone who knew how to listen. He was feared for his strength, his skill with horses, and the silence he carried. He didn't need words to intimidate, his gaze was enough. In taverns, stories were told of how he had once faced 3 men single-handedly, of how he tamed wild horses with just the strength of his body. But no one knew the man behind the legend. No one knew that Quana spent his nights gazing at the stars, conversing with the spirits of his ancestors, asking for guidance for a future he didn't know how to build, because deep down, what he desired most wasn't war, wasn't blood. It was a home, a place where he could be just a man, not a warrior, not a savage. And he dreamed of building that with his own hands, even without knowing for whom. Mary Beth, slumped against his horse, still didn't know what to think. With each step, she heard the sound of Quana's steady breathing, felt the heat of his body on her back, and something inside her began to break. Fear. It was strange to trust someone she'd learned to fear, someone everyone called wild and dangerous. But there, on the horse's back, she wasn't judged, wasn't called a sinner. She was just a tired woman, her body aching and her soul exhausted. And Quana didn't ask questions. He just kept going, guiding them along trails that seemed known only to him and the wind. When they reached Quana's camp, a circle of stones and simple tents surrounded by dry trees, Mary Beth clambered down. She was dirty and exhausted, but Quana just as silently lit a fire, heated water, and offered her a blanket. It was there, under the starry sky, that Mary Beth finally burst into tears. Tears of shame, of fear, of relief. And the warrior sat there, a little distance away, respecting her space, letting the fire say what he couldn't put into words. You are safe here. I am not your owner. I am not your judge. I am just a man who also bears scars. At dawn, as the sun traced golden lines on the horizon, Mary Beth awoke to the smell of hot coffee. Quana was preparing breakfast unhurriedly, as if he already knew how to live at that pace. She watched him, and for the first time, realized there was no savagery in him, only strength and respect. Then she asked, in a low, shy voice, "Why did you help me?" Quana didn't answer right away. He looked up and said simply, "Because no one deserves to be left behind." Those words echoed within her like a balm. For the first time in days, she felt like she was still someone. Time in that forgotten land wasn't measured in hours, but in transformations. Each sunrise seemed to renew a part of Mary Beth's soul, as she gradually discovered a strength she hadn't known existed. Quana didn't ask about her past, but his attentive gaze showed he knew the weight she carried. In return, he also began to open up in gestures, teaching her about the stars, how the wind tells stories, how every tree, even dry, holds the memory of the rain that once fell. Marybeth listened attentively, feeling reborn in those lessons that were not in books, but in the earth, the sky, and the Comanche's steady gaze. As the days passed, Marybeth began helping around the camp. She cleaned, organized, and learned how to do small daily tasks for Quanah. Each gesture was a building block in the rebuilding of her dignity. And something invisible began to form between them, a bond of respect and complicity that needed no words. Quanah watched her work, and there was a quiet pride in his gaze. She was no longer the humiliated bride. She was a woman who, even wounded, chose to stand tall. And he, who had never dreamed of sharing his world with anyone, began to understand what it was like to have company without feeling threatened, without needing to prove anything. It was on one of those nights, under a star-filled sky, that Quanah made a decision. He got up, grabbed a piece of wood, and began drawing the outlines of a house on the ground. Not a tent, not a temporary shelter, but a real home. Marybeth approached, curious, and he said, "This is no place for a woman to live in tents. You need a home." She looked at him in surprise, her heart racing. It wasn't a marriage proposal. It wasn't a promise of love. It was something deeper, an invitation to start over. From that day on, Quanah began to work tirelessly. He cut wood from the strongest trees, shaping each plank with patience and precision. Sweat ran down his strong, tanned body, but he didn't complain. Each hammer blow was a silent cry against the prejudice that called him a savage. Because a savage doesn't build a home, a savage doesn't dream of a home. And that was what he wanted to prove, not with words, but with each wall he built, with each stone fitted in its right place. Marybeth helped as best she could, bringing water, holding tools, learning that love can also be born from shared work. The village soon learned of the news. "The savage builds a house for his banished bride," they said scornfully. But neither Quanah nor Marybeth cared. What mattered was what was being born there, amidst the sweat, the mud, and the open sky. A new beginning. She was no longer the sinner. He was no longer the barbarian. They were just two souls scarred by life, but determined to prove that true love needs no altar or blessings from those who have never known mercy. And with each plank raised, a new destiny was written in the arid land of the West. As the skeleton of the house began to take shape, Marybeth realized it wasn't just wood being stacked. Each log Quanah lifted carried an invisible weight, the weight of promises unmade, of dreams never spoken aloud. She watched his muscles tense with each axe blow, the sweat that ran like rivers down his chest, tanned by the Texas sun, and understood that this man, labeled a savage, had more humanity in his silence than any of those who had driven her from the church. One evening, as the sky turned a fiery red, Quanah stopped his work, wiped his forehead with his forearm, and stared at Marybeth with a seriousness that seemed to cut the air. "I don't know what it's like to be a church husband, but here, on this earth, I promise you that you will never be driven from anywhere again," he said. And each word was an oath carved into the very ground. Marybeth felt her chest tighten, not with pain, but with an emotion that made her eyes fill with tears without permission. No one had ever promised her anything, not love, not protection, not a future. And now, a man the world called a barbarian was there, promising not an alliance but a space, a home. It was as if he were building a wall between her and the past, a place where her name would no longer be synonymous with shame. She approached, touched the rough wood of the newly installed wall, and replied, "Then I promise I'll stay. I promise I'll learn to build too." And in that moment, between them something was born that no words could define. Complicity. As the weeks passed, the house began to take shape. The walls stood firm, the roof began to shield the merciless sun, and each new space was filled with a shared dream. There was no luxury, no gold, but every corner of the building breathed hope. Marybeth helped paint, clean, and organize, and as they worked together, she began to learn Quanah's stories about her tribe, about the spirits that guided the warriors, about respect for the land and ancestors. Each story told at dusk was a seed planted in her soul, and each day she blossomed a little more. But it wasn't long before the village began to feel truly uneasy. The men whispered in the taverns. The women watched from afar with venom and fear in their eyes. To them, the union was an affront, a sin that defied what they considered order and decency. A white woman with a savage? That won't end well, they said. And the larger Quana's household grew, the more resentment grew within the small hearts of that place. They couldn't accept that a Comanche was teaching everyone dignity, while they themselves wallowed in hypocrisy. Quana knew this. He knew the world wouldn't change because he built a house. But he didn't care, because each plank placed there was a silent affront, a silent cry, saying that no one can define someone's destiny by the blood they carry or the name they were given at birth. And Mary Beth, growing stronger, no longer bowed to the looks of contempt. She walked with her head held high, stained with paint, her hands calloused, but with the clear gaze of someone who knows she finally belongs somewhere. The day the house was finished was marked by a clear sky and a gentle wind that seemed to carry the whisper of Quana's ancestors. The roof was firm, the walls were precisely erected, the hard-packed floor smelled of fresh wood and earth moistened by the labor of so many days. There was no gold, no expensive furniture, but every corner exuded life, work, sweat, and hope. Quana, standing before the wooden door he himself had carved with symbols of his people, took a deep breath. Mary Beth stood beside him, her blonde hair now burnt by the sun, her eyes shining a steady blue, holding his hand. "Now you have a home." "Now we are," he said, in that low, deep voice that seemed to come from the earth. Mary Beth walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, feeling every nail, every groove, as if touching her own skin. It wasn't just a house, it was a rebirth. And in every corner, she saw Quana's face, the man who didn't ask who she had been, who didn't care about her sins or shame, who simply saw her as someone worthy of standing. She stopped before the window overlooking the endless desert horizon and said, "I was betrothed to a coward, but here I am the wife of a warrior." Quana just smiled sideways, a rare smile, but full of pride. To celebrate, Quana prepared a simple dinner: roasted meat, roots, and fruits they had gathered together. It wasn't a wedding feast, there were no guests, but there was something no altar had ever offered Mary Beth: truth. They ate sitting on the floor, sharing stories, silences, and glances that said more than any words could express. That night, under the roof they had built together, they slept side by side, not as a couple imposed by the church, but as two souls who had chosen each other. The desert wind lulled them to sleep, like an ancient song of a people who never bow. The village, upon learning the house was ready, fell silent. No one dared go there, but everyone knew there was something there they could never destroy: respect. And Mary Beth, waking up that first morning under the new roof, felt for the first time in a long time that she was her own person. She walked through the house, opened the door, and felt the sun warm her face. She took a deep breath and said to herself, "I am no longer the woman expelled from the church. I am the woman who built a home with a warrior." And so, in the middle of the dry land, a house stood as a silent monument to resistance, to the love that doesn't need permission, to the dignity born when two broken hearts refused to remain on the ground. And in that house, every wall told the story not of a savage and a sinner, but of a warrior and a woman reborn. A place where prejudice would never enter. Time passed, and Quana and Mary Beth's home, once isolated in the middle of nowhere, began to attract glances not only of contempt, but also of curiosity. The village children, more free of prejudice than the adults, approached to see the house of the savage and the sinful bride. Quana, always silent, simply watched, but it was Mary Beth who smiled first. She offered fresh bread she had learned to make with simple flour and care. Little by little, the little ones came and went home, telling stories of a place where there was no shouting or punishment, but work, peace, and warm food. Their mothers then began sending timid messages, asking for recipes or help with small repairs that no one else knew how to do. Without realizing it, the house born of prejudice became an involuntary refuge. Men who had once turned their faces away now brought tools, asked for help tending the horses or mending a fence. Quanah never said no, and Marybeth welcomed them with a firm, gentle gaze. Respect grew like wheat in fertile soil, even if prejudice still whispered through clenched teeth. But something was changing. The village, which had once spat on Quanah's name, was now beginning to learn from his silence, from his posture, from the firmness of the man who never needed words to teach dignity. On Sundays, as the church bells rang, Marybeth stood on her porch, gazing at the horizon in a simple dress with her hair braided. No longer ashamed, no longer a fugitive. She was a whole woman, knowing the value of what she had built alongside a man who needed no altar to promise fidelity. Quanah, beside her, kept her gaze fixed on the sky, on the shifting winds, as if sensing that the weather was finally on the right side. And on that porch, they both knew, the world may try to label you, but only you decide who you truly are. The children began to learn from Quanah how to care for animals, plant crops, and listen to the wind. Marybeth taught the girls to sew, bake bread, and care for the little things in life. The house became a school, a model, a resistance. Not because they asked, but because living well is a revolutionary act in lands that knew only pain and prejudice. What began as a shelter for two was now an open home for all who wanted to learn to live without judgment, without putting others down. And then one day, Marybeth stood before the shard glass mirror hanging on the kitchen wall and realized her face had changed. She was no longer the humiliated woman who had been expelled from church. She was a woman with steady eyes, a straight back, and a heart that knew how to love without fear. "This is me now," she told herself. And outside, the sound of Quanah's axe chopping wood was the soundtrack to the home they had created together. But not every community readily accepts what it doesn't understand. Some men in the village, still intoxicated by their own pride and racism, couldn't bear the thought of seeing a Comanche respected, admired even by their own children. It was a wound to the ego of those who had always believed that blood defines character. A group of 4 men, led by Marybeth's ex-fiancé, Thomas, planned to put an end to this aberration. They wanted to destroy what they couldn't control, the dignity that flourished in that house made of wood, sweat, and hope. In the dead of night, armed with torches and ready insults, they set out for the home of the savage and the woman the village had once expelled. Marybeth, who woke at the slightest noise, smelled smoke before any other sign. She woke Quanah, her gaze filled with urgency and fear. Quanah needed no words. She knew what was coming because she already knew the scent of hatred in the wind. She grabbed her spear, not as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of protection, and went out to face whatever came. The house was her temple, her promise, her home. No one would burn it. Marybeth stayed inside, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it was about to burst from her chest, but with the certainty that she was no longer the woman running away. She was the woman waiting steadfastly for her warrior's return. When the men arrived, Quanah was already waiting for them in front of the house, standing firm, his spear stuck in the ground like a warning. "Go back to your homes," he said, in a low but sharp voice. Thomas, drunk with pride and resentment, spat on the ground and laughed. "You don't belong here, savage. We will burn your shame along with this woman you stole from our church." But before he could take the first step, Quanah's gaze paralyzed him. It wasn't fear, it was involuntary respect. There was something about Quanah that not even the deepest hatred could penetrate: dignity. At that moment, the village children, followed by their mothers, appeared in the distance with lit lanterns. They came because they sensed danger, because they knew Quanah wasn't a threat, but a refuge. The women shouted, "Leave them alone! They haven't hurt anyone!" Thomas and his accomplices hesitated. The village was no longer on their side. Prejudice, at last, was beginning to give way to truth. Humiliated, the men retreated. not out of pity, but because they knew the entire village now saw Quanah not as a savage, but as a man who built a home where the world only wanted desert. Quanah returned inside, his face impassive but his heart racing. Marybeth was waiting for him with a tight embrace, her body saying without words, "You are my home." And in that embrace, there was no more fear, no more shame, only love. The love that faced prejudice and prevailed, because true home isn't made of wood or stone, it's made of two souls who refuse to bow to hate. Time cemented what prejudice tried to destroy. Quanah and Marybeth's home withstood not only sandstorms, but also the winds of ignorance. The village learned to accept what it could no longer deny. Here was a true home, forged by work and love. The wooden walls held not only stories, but lessons. Every child who crossed that threshold knew that the world could be different, that no one is born with the right to judge another by their blood. Quanah continued his work, silent but respected. Marybeth, now a woman with a firm gaze, had become a symbol of courage. She was no longer the expelled bride. She was the woman who had chosen her own path, alongside the one who gave her dignity. And there, in the heart of the Texas desert, what was once dust became home. The home that love built, where no one needed a church or a blessing to be complete. And you who heard this story, tell me, how many times have you let prejudice decide someone's worth? How many times have you turned your face away from someone who just needed a chance? Quanah and Marybeth teach us that no matter what the world says, what matters is what you build with your hands and your heart. A true home is born where there is respect, work, and love. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that no one should live with their head down. Subscribe to the channel, share on WhatsApp, and comment where you're listening from. I'd love to hear it. And keep watching our videos. Each story here is an invitation to see the world through different eyes. Thank you for listening until the end. And remember, no one is savage because they were born different. Savage is the one who doesn't know how to love.